The famous pianist told a blind girl to play just for fun, but she had an unbelievable gift. "Hey kid, play something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday." The voice of renowned pianist Victor Stone echoed through the grand hall of the Metropolitan Arts Center, eliciting chuckles from New York's musical elite. Lila Vance, only 15, stood motionless by the Steinway grand piano. Her hand gripped her white cane as an awkward silence filled the room. She had come with her Aunt Clara, who sat in the fifth row. Victor adjusted his Armani tuxedo and smiled at the audience of patrons and music critics. At 45, he was considered one of the greatest interpreters of Chopin of his era, with sold-out world tours and multi-million-dollar contracts. To him, this out-of-place girl represented everything wrong with inclusion policies at cultural events. "Come on, don't be shy," Victor insisted, his voice laced with disdain. "I'm sure our generous sponsors would be delighted to see us investing in diversity." Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the foundation's director, muttered something inappropriate to her assistant, but did not intervene. After all, Victor Stone was the star of the evening, responsible for raising millions of dollars for the organization. Lila took a deep breath, her fingers tightening on her cane. No one there knew that she spent 8 hours a day practicing on a borrowed keyboard in the basement of her neighborhood church. No one knew that at the age of 5, she could reproduce entire symphonies after hearing them just once. And most importantly, no one imagined that at that moment, while everyone considered her an inconvenient obstacle, she was memorizing every note, every chord, every nuance of the arrogance that permeated the air. "Actually," Lila said, her calm voice cutting through the murmur of parallel conversations, "I prefer Bach." Victor truly laughed. "Bach, really? Which piece can you play, little girl?" The famous pianist's smile was about to freeze on his face as Lila replied with a composure that only exists in those who carry a secret too powerful to be revealed before the opportune moment. Partita number 2 in C minor. But perhaps it's a bit too advanced for this audience. The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the ticking of the old clock in the entrance hall. There was something in the way she stood, the quiet confidence in her words, that made some guests realize they were about to witness something far beyond a mere humiliation. Victor Stone felt a slight discomfort at her unexpected response. Partita number 2 in C minor is one of Bach's most technically and emotionally complex compositions, notoriously difficult even for seasoned pianists. How dare this girl suggest the audience isn't sophisticated enough, too advanced? Victor repeated, his voice growing sharper. "Little girl, you're talking to people who fund the world's greatest symphony orchestras. Perhaps you don't understand where you are." The audience murmured in agreement. Mrs. Margaret Sterling, heiress to a banking empire and a major patron of the foundation, whispered to her companion, "How rude. Someone needs to teach this generation some manners." Lila remained motionless, but there was something subtle in the way she held her cane that had changed. Her fingers no longer trembled. On the contrary, they were completely relaxed, like a surgeon's fingers before a delicate operation. "Victor, Doctor," Robert Davies, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, interjected, "Perhaps we should proceed with the main program." No. Victor cut him off, now clearly annoyed by her supposed insubordination. "This Lila seems to doubt the sophistication of our guests. I think it's only fair that she demonstrates the musical superiority she's implying." Victor walked to the piano and played the first few bars of the Partita with grand, almost theatrical gestures. "You see, Lila, this is a piece that requires not only technique, but also emotional maturity, which takes decades to develop. Are you sure you want to expose yourself like this?" What Victor didn't know was that Lila knew every nuance of that performance. For the past 8 years, ever since she lost her sight in a car accident that also took her parents, she had dedicated every free moment to music, not as a hobby or out of innate talent, but out of necessity. It was the only way she could process pain that words couldn't touch. Her Aunt Clara, who worked as a cleaner at the city conservatory, helped her access rare recordings and Braille sheet music. Lila had memorized hundreds of pieces, not just studying the notes, but also historical interpretations, regional variations, and the emotional context of each composer. "Dr. Stone," Lila said, deliberately misusing his title, "you played the first few bars in D major, Partita number 2 is in C minor. A chilling silence filled the room. Victor felt blood rush to his face. He had deliberately changed the key to test if she truly knew the piece, but he didn't expect to be corrected in public. Obviously that was intentional, Victor lied, his voice losing its polished smoothness. I was testing her basic musical ear. I see, Lila replied with a composure that made some guests squirm in their seats. Then you must also know that Bach composed this partita after the death of his first wife, Maria Barbara. Each movement reflects a stage of grief. That's why playing it correctly requires more than technique. It requires experiencing true loss. That statement hit Victor like a punch to the gut. His interpretation of this piece had always been technically perfect, but cold, lacking the emotional depth that true connoisseurs always noticed, but never dared to comment on. Very well, Victor said, his mask of superiority beginning to crack. Since you're so knowledgeable about music theory, then show us in practice? Or do you want to continue impressing us with your encyclopedic knowledge? Lila approached the piano, resting her cane carefully against the chair. Her hands found the keys with the precision of someone who had envisioned thousands of keyboards in her mind. One question before I begin, Lila said, turning slightly towards the audience. Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their soul one note at a time? The silence that followed was different. It was no longer social discomfort, but recognition. Some guests began to realize that they were witnessing something far more profound than a mere musical performance. Victor felt a surge of anxiety. There was something in her posture, the way her hands glided over the keys, that suggested the evening would not unfold according to the humiliating script he had planned. What those privileged people couldn't see was that every scornful word, every pitying glance, every attempt to belittle her was nurturing something far more powerful than resentment. It was awakening the kind of strength that only comes from suffering transformed into purpose. And Lila was about to show that underestimating someone who has lost everything is the most dangerous mistake one can make. Lila's question hung in the air like a suspended note, creating an uncomfortable silence that made some guests shift in their seats. Victor felt his annoyance grow at her continued defiance. Enough of this cheap philosophy, Victor interrupted, his voice completely devoid of social pleasantries. Either you play now or you leave, so we can continue with the serious program for the evening. Margaret Sterling whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Honestly, I don't know why we allow just anyone into these events. A standard must be maintained. Lila slowly nodded, her hands still gliding over the keys. You're right about standards. They really are important. Her voice carried a calmness that made Dr. Davies frown, as if he sensed something others couldn't yet perceive. In the fifth row, Aunt Clara Thompson immediately recognized her niece's tone. It was the tone she used before tackling difficult math problems or when she was about to prove something she had secretly prepared. She had worked at the conservatory long enough to know that Lila was not just talented. She was a prodigy in a way few understood. Lila, Victor insisted, now clearly impatient. Are you going to play or not? Because I can assure you no one here has all night to listen to your existential musings. Actually, Lila replied, adjusting her posture on the bench, I'd like to change the suggestion a bit. Instead of partita number 2, why don't we play something more educational for the audience? Victor scoffed. Educational, kid? You're talking to people who fund entire conservatories. What exactly can you teach us? Lila turned slightly towards the audience, her blind eyes seemingly seeing through the social masks everyone was wearing. Then why don't we demonstrate the difference between playing the right notes and playing music? A murmur ran through the audience. Some guests exchanged confused glances, while others seemed offended by the implication. How dare she? Mrs. Eleanor Hayes muttered to her assistant as if someone like her could distinguish between superior technique and whatever she thought she could do. Victor felt himself losing control of the situation. This girl was clearly trying to manipulate the audience, creating some dramatic moment. It was time to end this farce once and for all. Very well, Victor said, walking to the piano. Since you want to teach a lesson, I will demonstrate first how to play this partita by someone who has truly studied music. Lila stepped off the bench, making way for Victor to sit down. What the famous pianist didn't notice was the almost imperceptible smile that flickered across her face, not of nervousness, but of someone who had just placed her opponent exactly where she wanted him. Victor began to play with his usual technical precision. Every note was in place, every rhythm perfectly measured. It was an impressive display of musical skill, developed over decades of formal training. As Victor played, Lila closed her eyes and did what she had learned years ago. She memorized not only the notes, but every nuance of the interpretation, every stylistic choice, every subtle pause. In her mind, she was capturing the entire performance, categorizing every element she could use against her opponent. Aunt Clara watched her niece with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that focus. It was the same focus Lila displayed when she spent hours studying recordings of long-dead masters, analyzing their interpretations like a detective examining evidence. Dr. Davies, sitting in the third row, also noticed something different in her posture. There was a stillness about her that reminded him of great artists before career-defining performances. A composure that came not from resignation, but from absolute preparation. Victor concluded the partita with a dramatic flourish, clearly pleased with himself. Polite applause followed, some commenting on his perfect technique and mature interpretation. "And now," Victor said, standing up and gesturing theatrically towards the piano, "let's see how she interprets this piece, which is clearly beyond her capabilities." Lila approached the bench again. But before sitting down, she did something unexpected. She turned to the audience and said, "Before I begin, I want you to know something about the piece you just heard." Victor frowned. "What are you talking about?" Partita number 2 was not just written as a technical exercise. Lila continued, her voice carrying an authority that commanded the room's attention. Bach composed it as a dialogue with grief. Each movement represents a different stage of grief for the loss of his wife, Maria Barbara. Some guests leaned forward, captivated by the shift in tone. "The first movement," Lila continued, "represents denial. The music refuses to accept the reality of loss. The second movement is anger against God, against fate, against music itself for not being able to bring the dead back to life." Victor rolled his eyes. "Any freshman knows that. You're not impressing anyone with basic historical context." Lila smiled again, but this time the smile reached her eyes. "You're right. Historical context is easy to memorize, but experiencing that pain personally, that changes everything." She sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. "The difference, Dr. Stone, between your interpretation and mine is not technique. It's that you played the notes Bach wrote. I will play the tears he shed." The silence that followed was unlike any silence before. There was an electric anticipation in the air, as if everyone felt they were about to witness something extraordinary. In the fifth row, Aunt Clara clenched her fists. She knew Lila was not just about to play music. She was about to lay bare her soul to strangers who had spent the entire evening underestimating her. It was both brave and terrifying at the same time. Victor still stood by the piano, his expression oscillating between annoyance and growing apprehension. There was something in her stance, the quiet confidence in her movements, that suggested the night would not end as he had planned. Lila took a deep breath and closed her eyes. In her mind, she was no longer in the room full of people who scorned her. She was back to that terrible day 8 years ago when she woke up in the hospital and discovered that she would never see her parents' faces again, that she would never see anything again. As her hands touched the first notes of the partita, a miracle happened in the grand hall. It wasn't just the same notes Victor had played minutes earlier. It was notes transformed by lived experience, by true pain, by genuine loss that had shaped every fiber of Lila's being. That's when everyone realized they had completely underestimated this blind girl from the suburbs. In her mind, she was capturing the entire performance, categorizing every element she could use against her opponent. Aunt Clara watched her niece with a mixture of pride and apprehension. She knew that focus. It was the same focus Lila displayed when she spent hours studying recordings of long-dead masters, analyzing their interpretations like a detective examining evidence. Dr. Davies, sitting in the third row, also noticed something different in her posture. There was a stillness about her that reminded him of great artists before career-defining performances. A composure that came not from resignation, but from absolute preparation. Victor concluded the partita with a dramatic flourish, clearly pleased with himself. Polite applause followed, some commenting on his perfect technique and mature interpretation. "And now," Victor said, standing up and gesturing theatrically towards the piano, "let's see how she interprets this piece, which is clearly beyond her capabilities." Lila approached the bench again, but before sitting down, she did something unexpected. She turned to the audience and said, "Before I begin, I want you to know something about the piece you just heard." Victor frowned. "What are you talking about?" "Partita number 2 was not just written as a technical exercise," Lila continued, her voice carrying an authority that commanded the room's attention. "Bach composed it as a dialogue with grief. Each movement represents a different stage of grief for the loss of his wife, Maria Barbara." Some guests leaned forward, captivated by the shift in tone. "The first movement," Lila continued, "represents denial. The music refuses to accept the reality of loss. The second movement is anger against God, against fate, against music itself, for not being able to bring the dead back to life." Victor rolled his eyes. "Any freshman knows that. You're not impressing anyone with basic historical context." Lila smiled again, but this time the smile reached her eyes. "You're right. Historical context is easy to memorize, but experiencing that pain personally, that changes everything." She sat down at the piano and placed her hands on the keys. "The difference, Doctor Stone, between your interpretation and mine is not technique. It's that you played the notes," Bach wrote. "I will play the tears he shed." The silence that followed was unlike any silence before. There was an electric anticipation in the air, as if everyone felt they were about to witness something extraordinary. In the fifth row, Aunt Clara clenched her fists. She knew Lila was not just about to play music. She was about to lay bare her soul to strangers who had spent the entire evening underestimating her. It was both brave and terrifying at the same time. Victor still stood by the piano, his expression oscillating between annoyance and growing apprehension. There was something in her stance, the quiet confidence in her movements that suggested the night would not end as he had planned. Lila took a deep breath and closed her eyes. In her mind, she was no longer in the room full of people who scorned her. She was back to that terrible day 8 years ago, when she woke up in the hospital and discovered that she would never see her parents' faces again, that she would never see anything again. As her hands touched the first notes of the partita, a miracle happened in the grand hall. It wasn't just the same notes Victor had played minutes earlier. It was notes transformed by lived experience, by true pain, by genuine loss that had shaped every fiber of Lila's being. That's when everyone realized they had completely underestimated this blind girl from the suburbs. Not just her technical ability, but the emotional depth she carried within her, and she was about to use every bit of accumulated suffering to turn her humiliation into something none of them would ever forget. The first notes emanating from the piano made Victor Stone instinctively recoil. It wasn't just the same notes he had played minutes earlier. It was notes transformed by a soul that had known darkness and found light in music. Lila played the partita as if she were speaking directly to Bach across centuries. Each passage carried the weight of her own experience, the brutal denial of loss at age 8, the anger against a world that only saw her as an obstacle. And finally, the transformative acceptance that had shaped her sacred relationship with music. "My God, Doctor," Davies whispered, leaning forward in his seat. "In 40 years of my musical career, I have never heard a performance with such emotional depth." Victor felt his legs tremble. Her technique was not just perfect, it was superior to his. Passages he had played with concentrated effort now flowed from Lila's fingers like clear water, as natural and inevitable as breath. Mrs. Margaret Sterling, who just minutes earlier had scoffed at her audacity, now had tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks. Lila's music was not just technically perfect, it was transformative, touching places in her soul she had forgotten existed. "How can this be, Mrs.?" Eleanor Hayes whispered to her assistant, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. The answer came in the form of the music itself. Lila wasn't just playing the partita, she was telling her story through it. The first movement became the story of a child who lost everything in the blink of an eye. The second movement, the anger of a teenager forced to navigate a world that saw her as inferior before knowing who she was. Victor watched, paralyzed, as his own interpretation was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something infinitely more powerful. Every musical choice he had made for decades, technically correct, but emotionally hollow, was being exposed by the raw genius of the girl he had tried to humiliate. As Lila reached the third movement, something extraordinary happened in the room. The movement representing acceptance and transcendence in Bach's philosophy took on an almost spiritual dimension. Lila was no longer playing for the audience. She was playing through them, connecting everyone in the room to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. "Victor, Doctor," Davies whispered, his voice heavy with awe. "This girl, she is one of the greatest natural talents I have ever witnessed." Victor felt something shatter inside his chest. It wasn't just his pride. It was the entire edifice of superiority he had built throughout his life. This blind white girl from the poor neighborhood was not just better than him. She was better than any pianist Victor had ever known. The entire room was now completely silent except for the transcendent music flowing from the piano. Those who came to flaunt their social status were now confronted with something so genuine and powerful that it could not be ignored or belittled. Lila approached the climax of the Partita, and it was then that Victor realized the full extent of his own arrogance. Every movement of hers revealed years of intensive study, iron discipline, and an understanding of music that far surpassed formal education. This is not amateur talent. This is musical genius forged in adversity. "She memorized our entire conversation," Victor muttered to himself, realizing it like a lightning strike. Every scornful tone, every contemptuous word. She knew exactly what she was doing. Aunt Clara Thompson in the fifth row smiled through her tears. She had watched Lila practice until her hands bled, study Braille sheet music late into the night, memorize interpretations of long-dead masters. Now, finally, the world was seeing what she had always known existed. Victor looked around the room and saw his own destruction reflected in the faces of the musical elite. Mrs. Margaret Sterling looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and disgust. "Doctor." Davies slowly shook his head, clearly reevaluating everything he thought about Victor Stone. "How dare you? Mrs." Eleanor Hayes whispered, her eyes fixed on Victor. "Try to humiliate a child with such an extraordinary gift." Victor tried to utter a reply, but the words caught in his throat. No explanation could justify what he had done. He had tried to use his privileged position to crush a girl who represented everything music should be: pure, honest, and transformative. Lila ended the partita with a subtlety that made the ensuing silence sacred. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if sealing a covenant with the music she had just unleashed. When she finally stood up and turned to face the audience, there was no arrogant triumph on her face, only the quiet dignity of someone who had shared her soul and knew she had honored both Bach and her own journey. The applause that followed was unlike anything that room had ever witnessed. It wasn't just applause. It was recognition, apology, and homage, all at once. Everyone stood as if they were in the presence of something sacred. Victor stood motionless, watching his reputation being rewritten in real time. Everyone in the room now knew that he had tried to crush a musical genius out of pure prejudice. Amidst the chaos of congratulations, as Lila was embraced by Aunt Clara, two uniformed police officers, who had been observing the performance from the audience, calmly walked onto the stage. Their sudden appearance caused the applause to die down. Murmurs began to rise, and curiosity and apprehension filled the hall. All eyes turned to them, wondering what was happening. The atmosphere shifted from elation to tension, a premonition of a significant event about to unfold, an event that would completely change the dynamic of this evening, and perhaps Victor Stone's entire life. One police officer, with a stern expression, held up his badge and said, his voice clear and cold, echoing through the hall, overriding all murmurs, "Maestro Victor Stone, you are under arrest for hit and run 12 years ago, which led to the death of Mr. and Mrs. Miller and caused serious injury to their daughter." The words were like a thunderclap, plunging the entire hall into chaos. Gasps of astonishment, whispers, and continuous camera flashes capturing this shocking moment. Aunt Clara was stunned. She had no idea about this horrifying truth. She looked at Victor, her eyes filled with shock and indignation. "Victor Stone, the arrogant artist who had just been humiliated on stage, now stood there, his face pale, devoid of any pride. His eyes were empty, as if his soul had left his body. The truth about that fateful rainy night 12 years ago flashed vividly in his mind, like a horrifying film. On a torrential rainy night, he drove in a bad mood, after a fierce argument with an old teacher. Anger and arrogance had made him lose control, causing a serious car accident. His car had crashed into another, and he had heard screams, shattering glass, and colliding metal. Instead of facing the consequences, fearing it would affect his rising career, he cowardly fled the scene, leaving the victims in a pool of blood, leaving a haunting obsession that plagued him for the past 12 years. He had tried to bury that memory, using fame and arrogance to cover up his guilt. But now, everything was exposed. Lila, hearing her biological parents' names, Mr. and Mrs. Vance, turned towards the police officer's voice. Her face revealed confusion, and an old pain resurfaced. Memories of the accident, of her parents, of her eyes no longer seeing light, all rushed back like a tsunami, engulfing her in profound grief. She had lived with that pain for 12 years, unaware that the perpetrator of her family's tragedy was the arrogant man standing before her, the one who had just humiliated her, and who now faced justice. Victor did not resist. He looked at Lila, a look containing unspoken regret. His eyes no longer held contempt or arrogance, but only remorse, an acceptance of fate. He accepted his arrest as an atonement for the wrongs he had committed. 2 police officers handcuffed Victor, leading him off the stage, amidst flashing lights and murmurs from the audience. Justice, though delayed, was finally served, not only for the Vance family, but also for Victor Stone himself, who had to face the cruel truth about himself. Years later, Lila Vance became a renowned pianist, a symbol of resilience and the healing power of art. She played music not only with masterful technique, but also with her whole heart, conveying profound messages of love, pain, and hope. Her concerts were always packed, not only because of her talent, but also because of her inspiring story, the story of a visually impaired girl who overcame tragedy to find light in music. She established the Lila Vance Foundation to help talented young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially those with disabilities. The foundation became a beacon of hope, where music lovers found support and opportunities to develop their talents, where they could turn pain into strength and darkness into light. While Lila flourished, Victor Stone faced a very different reality. His contracts with major orchestras were canceled one by one. Videos of Lila's performance and Victor's arrest went viral, attracting millions of views and scathing comments about prejudice disguised as cultural elitism. The story concludes by affirming that music is not just notes, it is the echo of truth. And truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually find its own melody to be heard. Lila Vance, with her music, proved that true art lies not in technical showmanship, but in the ability to touch hearts, to heal wounds, and to bring hope to lost souls. Her music is a reminder that no matter how difficult life gets, no matter how much darkness surrounds us, there is always a melody of hope, a melody of truth, waiting to be sung. As Lila always told young students facing discrimination, the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine. Have you ever witnessed talent wasted due to prejudice? How did you react when you saw injustice disguised as tradition? Share your experiences in the comments section and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove true value always transcends empty privilege.